The window shattered inward as thunder cracked across the sky, and Elena shot up in bed, with her heart slamming against her ribs. For one terrible second she thought someone had broken into her room. Glass glittered on the floor near the curtains, caught in the flash of lightning that lit the whole room white. She grabbed the small lamp beside her bed like a weapon and pressed her back against the headboard, waiting for a shape to move in the darkness. Nothing did. The rain hammered the broken window, and cold wind rushed in, but the room stayed empty. Elena forced herself to breathe. She was new here, only 3 weeks into her position as the pack's healer, and she still did not know every sound this old house made. Maybe an old branch had finally given way and struck the glass. She told herself that story twice before she believed it enough to move. She swung her legs out of bed, wincing as her bare feet found a piece of glass on the rug, and limped toward the window to see the damage. The branch theory fell apart the moment she looked outside. There was no broken branch on the ground beneath her window. There was only wet grass, empty and undisturbed, glowing faintly under the porch light 2 floors down. Something had hit the glass from outside, hard enough to break it, and then vanished. Elena's mind ran through every warning she had been given since she arrived at the pack house. She was human, one of only a handful in a building full of shifters, and the older healer who trained her had told her plainly, "Never open your window during a storm, never wander the halls after midnight, and never, under any circumstance, go looking for the Alpha King when the sky turns violent." At the time she had laughed, assuming it was pack superstition, the kind of thing older generations passed down without ever explaining why. Now, standing in broken glass with the storm screaming outside, the warning did not feel like superstition at all. A low growl came from the hallway. Elena froze. The sound was not loud, but it carried a weight that pressed against her chest, low and rumbling, more felt than heard. She backed away from the window and turned toward her bedroom door, gripping the lamp tighter. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable click of claws against the wooden floor. Her door was not locked. She had never seen the point of locking it inside a house full of people sworn to protect each other. Now she regretted that decision completely. The door creaked open on its own, pushed by something low to the ground, and Elena's breath caught in her throat as a massive black wolf slipped through the gap. It was easily the size of a large horse, its fur soaked and matted from the rain, its shoulders trembling with every step. Elena had seen wolves before, other members of the pack in their shifted forms, but none of them compared to this. Its size alone told her everything she needed to know about who stood in her doorway, dripping water onto her floor. The Alpha King. Cale Ashworth, ruler of the entire territory, the wolf whose name alone made rogue packs retreat without a fight, was standing in her bedroom in the middle of the night, and he was shaking. Elena's first instinct was fear, sharp and immediate, and she pressed herself against the wall as the wolf's dark eyes found hers. But the eyes that met hers were not predatory. They were wide, glassy, filled with something she recognized instantly because she had seen it on the faces of frightened patients 100 times before. He was terrified. Thunder cracked outside, louder than before, and the wolf flinched so violently that his claws scraped deep grooves into her wooden floor. A whine escaped him, small and broken, a sound that seemed impossible coming from something so large and powerful. He backed toward her bed on shaking legs, and before Elena could say a single word, he climbed onto the mattress and pushed his enormous head beneath her blanket, burying himself, as though the thin fabric could shield him from the storm outside. Elena stood frozen against the wall, lamp still raised uselessly in her hand, staring at the sight of the most powerful man in the region hiding under her blanket like a frightened child. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wolf's massive body took up nearly the entire bed, his flank rising and falling with fast, shallow breaths. Every time thunder rolled across the sky, a shudder ran through his frame, and the whine returned, muffled now beneath the blanket. Elena lowered the lamp slowly and set it on the nightstand. Her mind raced through a dozen possible responses. She could run. She could call for help. She could try to wake one of the guards down the hall. But some instinct, the same one that guided her hands when treating frightened patients, told her that running would only make things worse. Whatever this was, it was not an attack. It was something far more private, something she was clearly never meant to witness. She took a careful step toward the bed. The wolf's ear twitched at the sound, but he did not lift his head from beneath the blanket. Elena took another step, then another, until she stood at the edge of the mattress, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his massive body despite the rain still soaking his fur. "It's all right," she whispered, unsure why she said it, unsure if a wolf even understood human words in this form. "It's just a storm. It will pass." The wolf went still. Thunder rumbled again, quieter this time, farther away, and Elena watched the tension in his shoulders ease by the smallest fraction. She did not move closer. She did not touch him. She simply stood there, speaking softly into the darkness, telling him the storm would end, that he was safe, that nothing in this room could hurt him. She had no idea if any of it mattered to him. But slowly, gradually, his breathing began to slow. Minutes passed. The rain softened from a roar to a steady patter against the broken window, and the wind that had rushed through the shattered glass began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a quiet companion to the strange scene unfolding in the room. Elena finally allowed herself to sit on the very edge of the bed, keeping a respectful distance from the wolf's enormous form, and continued speaking in a low, even voice about nothing important at all. The weather, the garden she had noticed behind the pack house, the herbs she planned to grow once spring arrived. She was not sure when he stopped shaking entirely, but at some point she noticed the storm had passed, and the room had gone quiet except for the sound of steady breathing beside her. Elena looked down at the black wolf curled against her side, his massive head still tucked partially beneath the blanket, fast asleep. She sat there for a long time, unsure what to do next. Waking him felt dangerous. Leaving him there felt impossible to explain if anyone found them like this. In the end, exhaustion won over caution, and she carefully lay back against her pillow, keeping as much distance as the crowded bed allowed, and closed her eyes. When she woke the next morning, the wolf was gone. Elena sat up quickly, scanning the room for any sign that the night before had actually happened. The broken window remained, cold air still drifting through the jagged hole in the glass. Deep claw marks scarred the wooden floor near her door, but there was no wolf, no sign of Kale, nothing except the memory that felt more like a dream with every passing second. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, her mind spinning with questions she knew better than to ask out loud. The pack house was already busy with morning routines, warriors heading out for patrol, kitchen staff preparing breakfast, the low hum of normal life continuing as though nothing unusual had happened during the night. Elena scanned every face she passed, searching for some clue, some sign that anyone else knew what she had witnessed. No one looked back at her with anything other than polite greetings. She found Kale in the main hall an hour later, and the sight of him nearly stopped her in her tracks. Gone was any trace of the trembling creature from the night before. He stood tall and composed, dressed in dark clothing that fit him perfectly, discussing patrol schedules with two of his warriors, in a voice that carried authority without needing to be raised. His expression was calm, controlled, carved from the same cold confidence that had made him legendary throughout the region. He did not look at her. Elena told herself that was fine. She had no idea what the rules were for a moment like this, whether alphas simply pretended these things never happened, whether admitting weakness of any kind was forbidden among his kind. She busied herself with her morning duties, checking on two warriors recovering from training injuries, restocking her small supply of herbs and bandages, and tried to push the strange night from her mind entirely. It did not stay pushed for long. Around midday, one of the older healers, a soft-spoken woman named Margaret who had trained Elena since her arrival, found her sorting dried herbs in the small clinic room at the back of the house. "You look tired," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from her, with the ease of someone who had spent decades in this house. "Rough night?" Elena's hands stilled over the herbs. "The storm broke my window," she said carefully, choosing her words. "I didn't sleep well." Margaret's expression shifted, something knowing passing behind her eyes before she smoothed it away. "Storms can be difficult in this house," she said simply. "More difficult than people realize." Elena looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the doorway, as though checking for anyone who might overhear. "I mean nothing more than what I said," she replied, her voice dropping lower. "Just be careful what you notice around here, dear. Some things are not meant to be spoken about, even if you see them with your own eyes." Before Elena could press further, Margaret rose from her chair and left the room, leaving Elena alone, with more questions than she had started with. She sat there for a long moment, staring at the herbs scattered across the table, replaying the older woman's words over and over. Some things are not meant to be spoken about. That evening, Elena requested a new window be installed, and 2 of the household staff arrived within the hour to fix the damage, clearing away the broken glass without asking a single question about how it had happened. Elena watched them work in silence, noting how efficiently they moved, how practiced their motions seemed, as though replacing a broken window in the middle of the night was nothing new to them at all. Once they finished and left, Elena sat by her newly repaired window and stared out at the darkening sky, watching heavy clouds gather on the horizon. Another storm was coming. The weather reports had warned everyone at dinner, a stronger one than the night before. She thought about locking her door this time. She thought about moving to a different room entirely, somewhere further from wherever Kale's chambers were located. Instead, she found herself leaving the door unlocked. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the kind of professional interest a healer might have in an unusual condition she had never encountered before. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way his eyes had looked in the darkness, wide and afraid and so unlike the composed ruler she had seen commanding his warriors that morning. She told herself several things that night as she waited in bed, listening to the wind pick up outside, but none of those explanations felt entirely true. Around midnight, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, distant but unmistakable. Elena sat up in bed, pulling her knees to her chest, and waited. The second rumble came 10 minutes later, closer this time, and she heard something move in the hallway outside her door. Her heart began to race, not with fear this time, but with something closer to anticipation. She watched the door handle turn slowly, and once again, the massive black wolf pushed his way into her room, soaked from the rain that had just begun to fall outside. This time, he did not hesitate at the sight of her sitting awake in bed. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and climbed onto the mattress, pressing his trembling body against her side as thunder cracked directly overhead. Elena did not move away. She reached out, slow and careful, and rested her hand against the thick, wet fur along his shoulder, feeling the fine tremors running through his massive frame. "I'm here," she whispered, and this time she meant it as a promise rather than simple comfort. "You're not alone." The wolf pressed closer, and for the second night in a row, Elena found herself sitting awake in the darkness, beside the most powerful man in the territory, holding him together, one trembling breath at a time, wondering how many more storms it would take before he finally told her why. Morning came again, and again the wolf was gone before Elena opened her eyes, leaving only the faint impression of his weight on the mattress and a few strands of dark fur caught in the blanket. She gathered them carefully and placed them in a small cloth pouch she kept in her drawer, though she could not explain to herself why she wanted to keep any proof of what had happened. 3 days passed without another storm, and life in the pack house settled into its usual rhythm. Elena treated a young warrior named Oliver for a sprained wrist, restocked the clinic's supply of bandages, and spent her evenings reading by candlelight in her room, trying not to think about black fur and frightened eyes. She told herself the strange nights were behind her, a passing storm season quirk that would fade once the weather calmed. She was wrong. On the 4th evening, she was summoned to the main hall for dinner with the senior members of the pack, an invitation that surprised her, given her short time in the household. She dressed in her simplest formal clothing and made her way downstairs, arriving to find a long table filled with warriors, advisors, and Kale himself, seated at the head, exactly as composed and distant as he had been every day since the storms began. Elena took her assigned seat near the middle of the table, careful not to look toward the head too often, though she felt his presence the entire meal, like a weight pressing against her attention. Conversation flowed around her, discussions of patrol routes, territory disputes with a neighboring pack, and preparations for an upcoming gathering of regional alphas. Elena listened politely, contributing when asked about medical supplies, but her mind kept drifting back to the 2 nights that no one at this table seemed to know anything about. Near the end of the meal, an older man seated close to Kale leaned forward and spoke in a voice meant to carry. His name, Elena would later learn, was Desmond, chief advisor to the Alpha King, and a man known throughout the house for his sharp tongue and sharper instincts. "The Southern pack grows bold," Desmond said, addressing Kale directly. They test our borders more each week. A king who cannot show strength during difficult seasons invites exactly this kind of challenge. The comment seemed to hang in the air longer than necessary, and Elena noticed several warriors exchange quick glances before returning their attention to their plates. Kale's expression did not change, but something in his posture stiffened, a subtle shift that Elena might have missed entirely if she had not spent 2 nights studying every small movement of his body language in wolf form. Our borders remain secure, Kale replied evenly. I have not given anyone reason to believe otherwise. Of course not, Desmond said smoothly, though his eyes lingered a moment too long. I only mean to say that perception matters as much as strength itself, especially during storm season, when certain weaknesses tend to become more visible to those watching closely. The words landed like a blade wrapped in silk, and Elena's stomach turned cold. Desmond knew, or at the very least, he suspected. The careful way he chose his words, the emphasis on storm season, the pointed reference to visible weakness, none of it felt accidental. Elena forced herself to keep eating, keeping her expression neutral, while her mind raced through the implications of what she had just witnessed. If Desmond knew about Kale's fear, others likely did too, and if a rival pack ever learned the truth, the consequences could reach far beyond a broken window and a frightened night. Dinner ended shortly after, and Elena excused herself as quickly as politeness allowed, retreating to the quiet of the clinic room to organize her thoughts. She was still sitting there an hour later, staring blankly at a shelf of dried herbs, when a soft knock sounded at the door. She looked up to find Kale standing in the doorway, fully dressed, fully composed, looking nothing at all like the trembling creature who had curled against her side 2 nights before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "May I come in?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Elena nodded, setting aside the herbs she had been sorting, and watched him step into the small room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He did not sit. He stood near the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on some point on the floor rather than meeting hers directly. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Elena replied gently, "but I would listen, if you wanted to share." Kale was quiet for a long moment, and Elena waited without pressing him, understanding instinctively that whatever he was about to say had likely never left his mouth before. Finally, he lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the vulnerability she saw there struck her harder than she expected. A raw honesty, completely at odds with the composed ruler she had watched command an entire table of warriors just an hour earlier. "What you saw," he began, choosing each word carefully, "is not something I have shared with anyone outside a very small circle. I would ask that it remain between us." "It already has," Elena said, "and it will continue to." Something in his shoulders eased slightly at her words, though the tension never fully left him. He glanced toward the window, where the evening sky remained clear and calm, no hint of storms on the horizon, and Elena watched him seem to gather courage from that simple fact before continuing. "My wolf carries a fear that I have never been able to control," he said. "It began many years ago, and it has never left, no matter how much strength I gain in every other part of my life. I did not choose to come to your room. My wolf chose it, during a moment when I had no control over his actions at all." Elena absorbed this carefully, understanding now that the 2 visits had not been deliberate choices on his part, but something closer to instinct taking over during moments of complete vulnerability. "Why my room?" she asked softly, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Kale's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't fully understand it myself," he admitted. "Perhaps because you are new here, and your presence carries no history, no expectation. Perhaps because something in you feels safe to him, even when he cannot explain why." The admission hung between them, quiet and honest, and Elena found herself unable to look away from him. Whatever careful distance she had planned to maintain around the Alpha King evaporated in that moment, replaced by something warmer and far more complicated. "I won't tell anyone," she said again, firmer this time. "Not Margaret, not Desmond, not anyone. What you carry is yours to share, if and when you choose to." Kale studied her for a long moment, as though searching her face for any trace of deception, and whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude that carried more weight than words could have managed, and turned to leave the room. At the doorway, he paused. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying, both nights. Most people would have run." Before Elena could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the small clinic room, with her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit, and a growing certainty that whatever storm had brought Cale Ashworth into her life was far from finished with either of them. Word of the private conversation between Elena and the Alpha King never spread through the house, but something subtler took its place. Cale began finding reasons to walk past the clinic room more often than his schedule required. He asked after her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with medicine, lingered a few extra minutes during morning briefings when she happened to be present, and once, without any clear reason, sent a servant to deliver a small bundle of rare herbs from the Southern Territory that he claimed had simply been sitting unused in storage. Elena noticed all of it, and she suspected everyone else in the house noticed too. Margaret, in particular, began watching her with a careful curiosity that Elena found difficult to ignore. One afternoon, while the two women organized a fresh shipment of bandages in the clinic, Margaret broke the silence with a question that caught Elena off guard. "How long have you known about him?" Margaret asked, not looking up from her work. Elena's hands stilled. "Known about what?" "You can keep pretending if it makes you comfortable," Margaret said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But I have worked in this house for 23 years, and I know the look of someone who has seen something they were never meant to see. I saw it in your face the morning after the first storm, and I have watched it grow every day since." Elena set down the roll of bandages she had been holding and considered her next words carefully. She trusted Margaret, had trusted her since the very first week of her arrival, but Cale's secret was not hers alone to share. "I can't discuss it," she said finally, "not because I don't trust you, but because it isn't mine to tell." Margaret's expression softened, any trace of teasing disappearing entirely. "That answer tells me everything I need to know," she said quietly. "And it tells me you understand exactly how serious this is. Be careful, Elena. Some secrets in this house have teeth." The warning settled uneasily in Elena's chest, and she found herself thinking about Desmond's pointed comments at dinner more than once over the following days. She began paying closer attention to the way certain warriors spoke about the upcoming gathering of regional alphas, an event that would bring rulers from every neighboring territory together, under one roof, to negotiate borders, trade routes, and alliances. If Cale's fear became known before that gathering, she worried what kind of leverage it might hand to rivals looking for any excuse to challenge his authority. Nearly 2 weeks passed without another storm, and Elena began to wonder if the strange chapter of her life had quietly closed on its own. She continued her work in the clinic, treated minor injuries among the pack's warriors, and slowly built friendships with several of the younger staff members who had grown curious about the human healer living among them. A cheerful young woman named Clara, who worked in the kitchens, became a frequent visitor to the clinic, bringing fresh bread and gossip in equal measure. It was Clara, in fact, who first mentioned the gathering directly to Elena. "Everyone is talking about it," Clara said one afternoon, perched on the edge of the clinic table, while Elena mixed a salve for a warrior's burned hand. "Alphas from 4 different territories, all staying under this roof for a full week. My mother says the last gathering like this ended in a fight that nearly burned down the eastern wing." "That sounds dangerous," Elena said, only half paying attention as she measured herbs into the mixture. "It's mostly politics," Clara said with a shrug, "everyone pretending to be friendly, while looking for weaknesses in each other. My mother always says, the real danger during these gatherings isn't the fighting, it's the watching. Every alpha brings spies disguised as guards, hoping to learn something useful about their rivals." Elena's hands stilled over the mortar and pestle, Clara's casual words landing with far more weight than the young woman likely intended. Spies disguised as guards, watching for weaknesses. If even a fraction of that was true, then a gathering of this size would be the worst possible time for anyone to discover the truth about Cale's fear of storms. That evening, Elena sought out Cale directly, finding him in his study reviewing documents by candlelight. She knocked softly, and he waved her inside without looking up immediately, though his expression shifted the moment he recognized her. "I need to ask you something," Elena said, closing the door behind her. "About the gathering." Cale set down his papers, giving her his full attention. "What about it? How many people know," she asked directly, "about your wolf, about the storms? Beyond myself and whoever else you have already trusted. Cale's expression grew guarded, and for a moment, Elena worried she had overstepped. But he answered honestly, his voice low. Desmond knows, though we have never spoken of it directly. A handful of warriors who served under my father likely suspect, though none have ever confirmed it openly. Beyond that, I have worked very hard to ensure the knowledge stays contained. And if a storm comes during the gathering, Elena pressed gently. What happens then? The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. Cale's jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly against the edge of his desk, and Elena watched a flicker of the same fear she had witnessed twice now in his wolf form pass briefly across his human features, before he masked it away. I have managed it before, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I will manage it again. How? Elena asked, unable to stop herself. By locking yourself away, and hoping no one notices your absence during a week, when every guest in this house is specifically watching your every move. Cale did not answer immediately, and Elena realized she had spoken more directly than she intended, perhaps more directly than anyone in this house dared speak to their alpha king. But rather than anger, what crossed his face was something closer to relief, as though her blunt honesty was a comfort rather than an insult. What would you suggest? He asked quietly. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I think pretending this problem doesn't exist has never actually solved it. Maybe it's time to think differently. Cale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then he nodded slowly. The gathering begins in 12 days, he said. If you have thoughts on how to manage this, I would welcome them. Elena left his study that night, with her mind already spinning through possibilities, though none of them felt fully formed yet. She thought about weather patterns, about private rooms far from prying eyes, about trusted warriors who could provide cover stories during any sudden absence. But mostly, she thought about the way Cale had looked at her when he asked for her help, as though her opinion carried real weight in a matter that could determine the stability of his entire rule. Over the following days, Elena found herself spending more time near Cale's study, ostensibly delivering medical reports, but really searching for opportunities to discuss the growing problem of the gathering. Their conversations grew longer, drifting occasionally away from strategy, into quieter, more personal territory. She learned that Cale had lost his parents at a young age, that he had been forced into leadership long before he felt ready, that the weight of an entire territory's survival had rested on his shoulders since he was barely old enough to understand what that responsibility truly meant. She began to understand, slowly, that his fear of storms was not simply an isolated weakness, but a single crack in an otherwise flawless mask he had worn every single day since childhood, a mask built entirely from necessity rather than choice. And she began to realize, with a growing unease she could not quite name, that she was starting to care about the man behind that mask, far more than any healer should care about the ruler she served. 10 days before the gathering, the weather reports turned grim. A storm system was building over the coast, larger than anything the region had seen in years, and it was expected to arrive exactly when the visiting alphas would be settling into the packhouse. Elena heard the news from Clara first, delivered with the same casual excitement Clara brought to every piece of gossip, completely unaware of the dread the forecast triggered in Elena's chest. She found Cale later that evening in the study, and the moment she mentioned the storm's timing, she watched the color drain slightly from his face. 12 years of careful planning, he said quietly, staring at the window as though he could see the storm already gathering beyond the horizon, and the weather chooses this exact week to betray me. It doesn't have to be a disaster, Elena said, though she felt far less certain than her voice suggested. We have 10 days to prepare. Together, they began building a plan. Elena suggested private quarters positioned as far from the main gathering halls as possible, rooms with thick walls and heavy curtains that could muffle both sound and light during the worst of any storm. Cale arranged for a small circle of trusted warriors, men who had served his family for decades and who already carried suspicions about his condition, to serve as discreet cover during any sudden disappearance, ready to explain his absence as urgent border business or private negotiations that could not be interrupted. Elena also proposed something Cale initially resisted, a formal reason for her own presence to remain close to him throughout the week, something official enough that no visiting alpha would question why the pack's healer stayed near their host during private hours. "They will assume things," Kale said carefully, when she first raised the idea, "about what your closeness to me means." "Let them assume," Elena replied. "A little gossip about a healer's attentiveness is far less dangerous than the truth." Kale did not argue further, and slowly, the pieces of their plan came together. Elena would be introduced formally as his personal healer, a position with legitimate reason to remain near him during any hour of the day or night, citing an old injury that occasionally required monitoring, a lie simple enough that no one would think to question it deeply. If a storm arrived during the gathering, Elena would be the one to guide him quietly to the private quarters, using her position as cover for what would actually be an act of comfort rather than medicine. The days leading up to the gathering passed in a blur of preparation. Elena barely had time to think about anything beyond logistics, checking supply closets, reviewing emergency herbs, memorizing the layout of hallways she would need to navigate quickly and quietly if the worst happened. Kale grew more withdrawn as the date approached, the pressure of hosting 4 rival alphas weighing visibly on him, even without factoring in his hidden fear. 2 nights before the gathering began, Elena found him standing alone on a balcony, overlooking the training grounds, staring up at a sky still clear of any storm clouds, though everyone knew that would not last much longer. "You could tell them the truth," Elena said quietly, joining him at the railing. "Some of them at least, the ones you trust most." Kale shook his head immediately. "Weakness shown to rivals is weakness exploited," he said. "My father taught me that lesson before I understood what it truly meant, and every year since has only proven him right." "Fear isn't weakness," Elena said softly. "Everyone carries something they're afraid of. What matters is what you do despite that fear, not whether the fear exists at all." Kale turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded passing across his features in the dim light. "You speak as though it were simple," he said. "I don't think it's simple," Elena admitted. "I think it's terrifying, and exhausting, and lonely, carrying something like this, while pretending every single day that you carry nothing at all. But I also think you don't have to carry it entirely alone anymore." The silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled with something neither of them dared name directly. Finally, Kale reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers where they rested on the railing, a small gesture that felt far larger than its size suggested. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not treating me differently since that first night, for not looking at me like I am less than what I was before." "You are not less," Elena said firmly. "If anything, I think you're more. It takes strength to keep leading a whole territory while carrying something this heavy in silence." Kale's fingers tightened slightly around hers, and for a moment, standing together on that balcony, beneath a still calm sky, the weight of the coming storm and the coming gathering felt distant, replaced instead by something quieter and far more personal passing between them. The gathering began the following afternoon, and the pack house transformed almost overnight into something Elena barely recognized. Warriors from 4 different territories filled the halls, each group eyeing the others with careful suspicion, disguised as polite formality. The visiting alphas arrived with their own advisors and guards, filling the dining hall with tense conversation and carefully measured smiles that rarely reached anyone's eyes. Elena was introduced exactly as planned, presented to the visiting rulers as Kale's personal healer, tasked with monitoring an old training injury that occasionally flared without warning. Most of the visitors accepted the explanation without much curiosity, though Elena noticed Desmond watching the introduction with a knowing look that told her he understood exactly what role she was truly meant to play during the week ahead. The first 2 days passed without incident. The sky remained clear. Negotiations proceeded with the usual mixture of tension and diplomacy, and Elena began to allow herself a small measure of hope that perhaps the storm forecasts had been wrong. She spent her days near the gathering halls, officially available should Kale's injury require attention, unofficially watching him navigate a room full of rivals with the same commanding presence she had witnessed during their very first meeting. It was on the 3rd evening, during a formal dinner meant to celebrate the halfway point of the gathering, that Elena noticed the first change in the air outside, a subtle heaviness that most in the room seemed too distracted to detect. She caught Kale's eye across the crowded dining hall, and the flicker of recognition that passed between them confirmed her suspicion immediately. The storm was coming, days earlier than the forecasts had predicted, and it was going to arrive in the middle of dinner, surrounded by every rival alpha in the region. Elena excused herself from the table quietly, murmuring something about checking on medical supplies, and slipped out of the dining hall before anyone could question her departure too closely. She moved quickly through the corridors, toward the private study, where emergency supplies were kept, but her real destination was the small window at the end of the eastern hallway, the one with the clearest view of the sky beyond the training grounds. The clouds she found there confirmed everything she feared. Dark and heavy, rolling in far faster than any natural storm should move, they blotted out the last traces of evening light within minutes of her arrival. A distant rumble of thunder followed soon after, low but unmistakable, and Elena's heart began to race as she calculated how much time remained before the first lightning strike. She hurried back toward the dining hall, but before she reached the doors, she spotted Desmond standing near the entrance, watching her return with an expression that made her stomach twist uncomfortably. "Looking for something, healer?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough edge to make the question feel like an accusation. "Checking the weather," Elena replied, keeping her tone light. "It looked like rain earlier." "It looks like considerably more than rain," Desmond said, studying her closely. "Rather convenient timing for you to step away, just as the sky begins to turn, wouldn't you say?" Elena forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I have no control over the weather, advisor. Only over how prepared this house remains for whatever it brings." Desmond's eyes narrowed slightly, but before he could press further, another rumble of thunder sounded overhead, closer this time, and the sound seemed to pull his attention away from her long enough for Elena to slip past him back into the dining hall. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Several guests glanced uneasily toward the tall windows lining one wall of the hall, where the first heavy drops of rain had begun streaking down the glass. Conversation continued, but with a distracted quality now, as thunder rolled steadily closer with each passing minute. Elena found her way back to her seat near the middle of the table, close enough to watch Cale without drawing obvious attention. He remained composed, engaged in conversation with the alpha seated beside him, but Elena could see the tension building in the set of his shoulders, the slight stiffness in his movements that had not been there 20 minutes earlier. A flash of lightning lit the windows, followed almost immediately by a sharp crack of thunder directly overhead, loud enough to rattle the glass in its frames. Cale's hand tightened around his glass. Elena watched, heart pounding, as a visible tremor ran through him, quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape her notice. She glanced around the table, relieved to see most of the guests too absorbed in their own conversations, or too startled by the sudden storm, to notice the subtle change in their host's demeanor. But Desmond, seated further down the table, was watching Cale, with an intensity that made Elena's blood run cold. Another crash of thunder shook the room, and this time Cale's composure cracked visibly, his breathing growing shallow, his eyes darting toward the windows with an expression that no amount of practiced control could fully hide. Elena rose from her seat immediately, moving with purpose toward the head of the table. "Alpha," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, but calm enough to avoid drawing unnecessary alarm. "Your injury seems to be responding to the pressure change. I should examine it before it worsens." The excuse was thin, and Elena knew it, but it was enough. Cale rose from his seat with visible effort, offering the gathered alphas a brief apology about needing to address a lingering training injury, and allowed Elena to guide him from the dining hall with a hand firm against his arm. The moment they were out of sight around the corner, Cale's control shattered entirely. His breathing turned ragged, his steps faltering, and Elena felt the change beginning beneath her hand as his body shifted involuntarily, the shift he had clearly been fighting against for the last several minutes, finally overwhelming him. She pulled him quickly into a side corridor, away from the main hallway where any guest might wander, just as his human form gave way entirely to the massive black wolf she had come to recognize. Thunder cracked again, deafening in the enclosed space, and the wolf let out a sound that tore at Elena's heart, a sound far more distressed than either of the previous times she had witnessed his fear. "This way," she whispered urgently, guiding him toward the private quarters they had prepared days earlier, tucked far from the main gathering halls. The wolf followed her without hesitation, his massive body pressed close against her side as they moved quickly through empty corridors, every crash of thunder sending fresh tremors through his frame. They reached the private room, just as another lightning strike lit the hallway behind them, and Elena pulled him inside, closing the heavy door and drawing the thick curtains they had specifically chosen to muffle the storm's light and sound. The wolf collapsed onto the bed, prepared for exactly this purpose, burying his head against the pillows, his entire body shaking violently. Elena climbed onto the bed beside him, without hesitation, wrapping her arms as far as she could around his massive frame, pressing her forehead against his fur. "You're safe," she whispered, over and over, as the storm raged outside the heavily curtained window. "You're safe, and no one out there knows. I've got you." Outside the private quarters, in the dining hall they had left behind, Desmond watched the empty doorway where his Alpha King had disappeared, his expression unreadable, his mind already turning over questions that would not be so easily silenced. The storm lasted nearly 3 hours, far longer than any of the previous ones Elena had endured beside him, and by the time the thunder finally faded into distant rumbles and silence, both of them were exhausted. Kale's wolf form remained curled against her long after the worst of the storm passed, as though needing extra time to convince himself the danger had truly ended. Elena stayed beside him without complaint, her arms growing stiff, her eyes heavy with sleep she refused to give in to, until she was certain he was truly calm. When he finally shifted back to his human form sometime near midnight, he did so slowly, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. He did not immediately pull away from her, and for a long moment, they simply lay there in the darkness, his breathing gradually returning to normal, her hand still resting against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat steadying beneath her palm. "I need to return before someone notices my absence for too long," he said eventually, though he made no move to rise. "They already noticed," Elena said quietly. "Desmond was watching very closely when we left the hall." Kale's jaw tightened at the name. Of course he was. "What will you tell him?" Elena asked. "The same thing I have told him for years," Kale replied. "Nothing at all." He rose from the bed then, dressing quickly in the dim light, and Elena watched him transform once more, not physically this time, but in the careful reconstruction of his composed public mask, each movement deliberate, each expression practiced, until the trembling creature from an hour earlier had vanished entirely behind the Alpha King's familiar authority. "Thank you," he said quietly at the door. "For tonight, and for every night before it. I don't know how to properly repay what you've given me." "You don't need to repay anything," Elena said. "Just get through the rest of this week, and we'll deal with whatever comes next." He left, and Elena remained in the private quarters a while longer, gathering her thoughts before returning to her own room, careful to move through the halls as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. She passed no one on her way back, and by the time she finally collapsed into her own bed, exhaustion pulled her under almost immediately. The following morning, the gathering resumed, as though nothing had happened. Kale appeared at breakfast composed and alert, offering no explanation for his absence, beyond a brief mention of his old injury flaring during the storm. Most of the visiting alphas accepted this without further comment, their attention already consumed by the day's scheduled negotiations over border territories and trade agreements. But Desmond found Elena alone later that morning, cornering her near the clinic room, with an expression that left no room for polite evasion. "How long has this arrangement existed?" he asked directly, closing the door behind him. Elena kept her expression carefully neutral. "What arrangement do you mean, advisor?" "Do not insult my intelligence," Desmond said, his voice low and sharp. "I have served this family for over 2 decades. I watched Kale's father struggle with the very same affliction his son now carries, though he was fortunate enough to never need a healer's assistance quite this openly. I know precisely what happened last night, healer, and I suspect you know I know." Elena's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "Then you understand exactly why discretion matters more now than at any other point during this gathering." "I understand the stakes better than you ever could," Desmond replied. "What concerns me is your involvement, a human healer, barely 3 weeks into her position, suddenly at the center of the Alpha King's most closely guarded secret. Tell me why I should trust that your presence serves this pack's interests, rather than your own." The accusation stung more than Elena expected, and she felt a flash of anger rise beneath her carefully maintained composure. "My interest," she said firmly, "is keeping him safe, and by extension, keeping this entire territory secure from whatever chaos would follow if his rivals learned the truth. If you doubt my loyalty, watch my actions, rather than questioning my motives from suspicion alone. Desmond studied her for a long moment, something shifting slightly behind his sharp eyes. Perhaps, he said finally, though I would advise caution regardless. Whatever this arrangement has become between you and my alpha, remember that emotions clouding judgment during moments like last night could prove far more dangerous than the storm itself. He left without waiting for her response, leaving Elena standing alone in the clinic room, with his warning echoing uncomfortably in her mind. She knew he was not entirely wrong. Whatever she felt toward Cale had grown far beyond the professional boundaries she had initially intended to maintain, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that the growing attachment carried real risk, both to her own heart and to the delicate balance of power she was now entangled within. The remaining days of the gathering passed without another storm, though the tension in the pack house never fully eased. Elena continued her official duties, monitoring Cale's fictional injury during public hours, while privately watching him navigate increasingly difficult negotiations with rival alphas who seemed to sense an opportunity in whatever whispers had already begun circulating about his brief absence during dinner. On the final evening of the gathering, as guests began preparing for their departure the following morning, Cale found Elena alone, on the same balcony where they had spoken before the storms began. "It's over," he said, relief evident in his voice for the first time in days. "They're leaving tomorrow. And whatever suspicions Desmond or anyone else might harbor, no concrete proof exists beyond speculation." "That's good," Elena said, though something in her voice must have betrayed lingering worry, because Cale turned to study her more closely. "What troubles you?" he asked. "Desmond spoke with me," Elena admitted. "He knows more than either of us realized, about your father, about you, and he questioned my motives for staying close to you throughout all of this." Cale's expression darkened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Elena said. "That, I only want to keep you safe." Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her in the dim evening light, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that told Elena the conversation was about to shift into territory neither of them had directly acknowledged before. "Is that truly all it is?" he asked quietly. "Simply wanting to keep me safe?" Elena's breath caught, and she found herself unable to offer the easy, professional answer she had prepared for exactly this kind of moment. "I don't think it is anymore," she admitted softly. "I think it stopped being simple, somewhere around the second storm." Cale reached out then, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, tilting her face up toward his own. "For me as well," he said quietly. "Longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself." The gathering ended the following morning without incident, the visiting alphas departing with their entourages exactly as scheduled. But something fundamental had shifted between Elena and Cale during that final storm and the days that followed, something neither of them could easily undo, and something that Desmond's watchful eyes would not soon forget. In the weeks following the gathering, life in the pack house settled into a new and quietly transformed rhythm. Cale no longer hid his growing attachment to Elena behind careful distance, though he remained cautious about how openly he expressed it in front of the wider household. He began seeking her out during ordinary hours rather than only during moments of crisis, sharing meals when his schedule allowed, walking with her through the gardens behind the house as she gathered herbs for the clinic, asking her opinion on matters of pack governance that extended far beyond her role as healer. Elena found herself falling deeper into whatever this had become between them, though she remained careful about how she carried herself in public, aware that Desmond's suspicions had not faded simply because the gathering had ended successfully. If anything, his watchfulness seemed to sharpen with each passing week, his sharp eyes tracking every interaction between the healer and his alpha with quiet, careful attention. It was during one such evening, as Elena and Cale walked together through the gardens beneath a clear night sky, that he finally shared the full story behind his fear, the piece of himself he had only partially revealed during their earlier conversation in the clinic room. "I was 8 years old," he began, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the memory. "My parents were traveling home from a neighboring territory during negotiations that had grown tense over several months. A storm broke out during their journey, the kind that turns roads to mud and visibility to nothing. Rival warriors used the chaos of that storm to stage an ambush, believing correctly that the weather would slow any response from our own warriors. Elena listened quietly, sensing the weight of what he was about to share. I remember the messenger arriving at the pack house that night, Cale continued, soaked through from the rain, his face pale as he delivered the news to my grandfather, who was serving as regent until I came of age. I remember every crack of thunder that followed, because each one felt like it was announcing another piece of the tragedy, confirming what I already feared before anyone spoke the words aloud. Your parents died that night, Elena said softly, though it was not truly a question. Both of them, Cale confirmed, and ever since, something in me, something my wolf carries far more deeply than my human mind ever could, associates thunder and lightning with helplessness, with loss I could do nothing to prevent. I was a child then, powerless to save them, and no amount of strength I have gained since has ever fully convinced that part of me that I am not still that same helpless boy every time a storm arrives. Elena reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his without hesitation. That's not weakness, she said firmly. That's grief that never had a chance to heal properly, because you were forced into leadership before you ever had time to simply be a child who lost his parents. Cale's fingers tightened around hers. My grandfather believed showing that grief would have destroyed any chance I had of commanding respect as future alpha. He taught me to bury it, to present strength at all costs, and I learned that lesson so thoroughly that even now, decades later, I struggle to imagine any other way of carrying this weight. You don't have to imagine it alone anymore, Elena said. Whatever storms come, I intend to be there for them, for as long as you'll allow me to be. Cale turned to face her fully then, the moonlight catching the raw emotion in his expression, and he lifted his free hand to gently cup her face. I have ruled this territory for 12 years, he said quietly, and in all that time, I have never once considered sharing this burden with anyone beyond the smallest circle of trusted advisors. You arrived here barely 2 months ago, and somehow, you have become the only person I trust completely with the truth of who I really am. Maybe that's exactly why, Elena said softly. I came without history, without expectations, built from years of watching you present only strength. I simply saw you as you were, fear and all, and I never stopped caring. Cale leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she chose, but Elena remained still, and when his lips finally met hers, the kiss carried none of the careful restraint either of them had maintained during the weeks since the gathering. It was gentle at first, then deepened with the accumulated weight of everything unspoken between them. Every stolen glance, every quiet conversation, every storm they had weathered together in the growing intimacy of shared vulnerability. When they finally parted, Cale rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily in the quiet garden air. This complicates things considerably, he murmured, though his voice carried no regret. I know, Elena replied, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of his tone. Desmond will have opinions. Desmond always has opinions, Cale said, and for the first time since Elena had known him, she heard genuine warmth in his laugh, brief and quiet, but entirely real. But some things are worth the complications they bring. They remained in the garden a while longer, talking quietly about matters both significant and trivial, the growing bond between them settling into something neither of them felt any further need to hide from themselves, whatever challenges lay ahead in hiding it from everyone else. News of their closeness inevitably began spreading through the household in the days that followed, carried first through Clara's excited gossip in the kitchens, then through quieter, more calculated conversations among the pack's senior warriors and advisors. Most of the younger staff seemed genuinely pleased, having grown fond of Elena during her months in the house, and sensing a warmth in their alpha king that had rarely been visible before her arrival. But not everyone shared that enthusiasm, and Desmond's growing concern soon found company among a small faction of traditionalist warriors who viewed the entire situation with open suspicion, worried that a human healer's growing influence over their alpha represented a dangerous departure from generations of established pack hierarchy and tradition. The whispers grew louder with each passing week, though Cale did little to discourage them, choosing instead to let his actions speak clearly about his feelings toward Elena, rather than hiding behind denial. He began inviting her to sit beside him during formal pack meetings, sought her counsel openly on matters that extended well beyond healing, and made no effort to disguise the warmth in his expression whenever she entered a room. This openness, while a relief to Elena in some ways, also drew sharper attention from those within the pack who resented the shift. A senior warrior named Gareth, who had served under Cale's father and carried considerable influence among the older ranks, approached Desmond privately one afternoon, with concerns that quickly found their way back to Elena through Clara's ever-attentive ears. "They're saying a human shouldn't hold this much sway over pack decisions," Clara reported one evening, wringing her hands nervously as she delivered the news. "Gareth thinks it sets a dangerous example, that other packs will see weakness in an alpha who lets an outsider guide him." Elena absorbed this information carefully, understanding immediately the deeper fear beneath Gareth's complaint. It was not truly about her being human, or even about her growing closeness with Cale. It was about the same fear Desmond had voiced weeks earlier, during that tense dinner conversation. The fear that any perceived softness in their alpha invited challenge from those watching for exactly this kind of opportunity. She raised the concern with Cale that evening, finding him reviewing border reports in his study. "Gareth's opinion carries weight among the older warriors," Cale acknowledged, setting aside his papers. "But I will not hide my feelings for you simply to satisfy traditionalist concerns about appearances." "I'm not asking you to hide anything," Elena said. "I'm asking whether we should be more careful about how this affects your authority, especially with rival packs still watching for any sign of weakness." Cale's expression softened as he studied her. "You worry more about my authority than I do myself, sometimes." "Because your authority protects this entire territory," Elena replied. "I won't be the reason that protection weakens, not after everything you've already overcome." Cale rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. "Elena, listen to me carefully. My authority was built through years of proving myself in matters far more significant than personal relationships. Gareth and Desmond both know this. Their concern is not truly about you specifically, but about change itself, and change is something older generations often resist regardless of its actual merit. That doesn't make their concerns irrelevant," Elena pointed out. "No," Cale agreed, "it doesn't. But it also doesn't mean I should abandon something that has brought genuine light into a life I spent believing would only ever consist of duty and isolation." The conversation eased some of Elena's worry, though the underlying tension within the pack continued simmering beneath the surface over the following weeks. She noticed subtle shifts in how certain warriors treated her, a coolness in Gareth's greetings, careful distance maintained by a handful of others who clearly shared his concerns even if they lacked the courage to voice them directly. Despite this growing friction, Elena and Cale's bond only deepened. He shared more of himself with her during quiet evenings together, stories from his childhood before the tragedy that claimed his parents, hopes he carried for the future of the territory he had inherited far too young. Elena, in turn, shared pieces of her own history, the reasons she had chosen healing as her calling, the quiet ambitions she carried for expanding medical knowledge throughout the pack. Autumn deepened into the harshest part of storm season, and true to the pattern established earlier in the year, powerful storms continued rolling through the territory with increasing frequency. But something had changed in how Cale faced them. Though the fear never fully disappeared, Elena's steady presence beside him during each storm seemed to lessen its grip incrementally, the trembling less violent, the recovery afterward quicker than before. One particularly fierce evening, as thunder rolled continuously overhead for nearly 2 hours, Cale remained in his human form throughout the entire storm for the first time since Elena had known him, gripping her hand tightly, his breathing labored but controlled, refusing to let the fear fully claim him, even as lightning flashed brilliant and terrifying through the study windows. "You didn't shift," Elena said quietly afterward, amazed and proud in equal measure. "I focused on your hand instead of the thunder," Cale admitted, his voice still slightly unsteady. "It didn't erase the fear entirely, but it gave me something else to hold on to." Word of this small victory never spread beyond the two of them, but Elena carried a quiet satisfaction in knowing that whatever progress Cale made against his deepest fear, she had played some meaningful part in helping him find it. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to either of them, word of the packhouse's internal tensions and Cale's rumored vulnerability had begun traveling further than the traditionalist grumbling of Gareth and his allies. A rival pack from the Eastern Territory, long resentful of Kale's father's expansion of borders, decades earlier, and eager for any opportunity to reclaim lost ground, had received whispered reports through their own network of spies about strange occurrences within the pack house during recent storms. Their alpha, a calculating and ambitious leader named Victor, began quietly gathering information, patient and methodical, waiting for the right moment to test whether the rumors held any truth, and whether that truth might finally provide the opening his territory had sought for generations. The attack came on a night when the forecast had given no warning at all, a sudden storm system that built with unnatural speed over the western ridge bordering the territory, dark clouds rolling in within a single hour, where normally an entire afternoon of warning signs preceded any serious weather. Elena would later wonder, along with everyone else in the pack house, whether the timing had truly been coincidence or something far more deliberate, but in the chaos of that night, there was no time to consider the question carefully. Elena was in the clinic room organizing supplies when the first distant howl of alarm echoed from the northern watchtower, followed quickly by the deep, resonant horn that signaled an active border breach. She dropped what she was holding and rushed toward the main hall, meeting a flood of warriors already mobilizing in response to the alert. "Eastern Pack," one of the younger warriors called out as he ran past her, strapping on armor as he moved. "They've crossed into our territory near the ridge, moving fast." Elena's stomach dropped as thunder rumbled overhead, closer than she wanted to acknowledge, the storm arriving in perfect, terrible synchronization with the attack. She pushed through the gathering chaos toward Kale's study, finding him already dressed for battle, his expression carved from grim determination, despite the tension she could see building in his shoulders with each passing rumble of thunder. "They chose tonight deliberately," Kale said the moment he saw her, confirming her worst suspicion. "This storm isn't natural timing. Someone wanted this exact combination." "Desmond warned you," Elena said, though there was no accusation in her voice, only fear for what lay ahead. "Desmond warned me of exactly this scenario months ago," Kale replied, buckling on the last piece of his armor. "I need to lead my warriors to the ridge. If Victor's forces believe they can exploit a weakness in me during a storm, I need to prove them wrong immediately, before the fear has any chance to take hold." "You can't fight through the fear alone," Elena said urgently, stepping closer. "Let me come with you, close enough to help if the storm intensifies during the confrontation." Kale hesitated, clearly torn between wanting her safety secured far from any battle and recognizing the truth in what she offered. Another crash of thunder decided the matter, his jaw tightening visibly at the sound. "Stay close to Desmond's protection detail," he finally agreed. "Not on the front line, but near enough that you can reach me if needed." They moved together toward the ridge, joining a rapidly assembling force of warriors already preparing to repel the Eastern Pack's incursion. The storm intensified as they traveled, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white streaks, thunder rolling almost continuously now, and Elena watched with growing concern as Kale's composure began fraying at the edges despite his evident determination to hold steady. They arrived at the ridge to find Victor's forces already engaging the outer border patrol, dozens of warriors clashing in the driving rain. The chaos of battle made even more disorienting by flashes of lightning that lit the scene in brief, violent bursts. Kale's presence rallied his warriors immediately, his voice carrying clear commands across the battlefield despite the storm's fury, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself hope that he might push through this confrontation without his fear ever surfacing. Then a massive bolt of lightning struck a tree less than 50 feet from where Kale stood, the crack of thunder that followed instantaneous and deafening, and Elena watched in horror as his entire body seized with the same violent tremor she had witnessed on that very first night. Victor, watching from across the battlefield with cold calculation, seemed to sense the shift immediately. He shouted orders to his warriors, redirecting their focus toward Kale's position, clearly believing he had found the exact vulnerability his spies had promised him. Elena did not think. She moved. Pushing past startled guards from Desmond's protection detail, she sprinted across muddy, chaotic ground toward Kale, reaching him just as his knees began to buckle beneath the weight of his fear. She grabbed his arm firmly, forcing him to look at her, rather than the storm raging overhead. "Look at me," she shouted, over the noise of battle and thunder combined. "Not the sky. Me. You are not that helpless child anymore, Kale. You are the Alpha King, who has protected this territory for 12 years, and every warrior on this field is counting on you right now." Kale's eyes found hers, wild with fear, but slowly, gradually focusing on her face, rather than the storm around them. "I can't," he gasped, his voice raw. "You already have," Elena insisted. "Every storm since that first night, you fought this fear, and survived it. This is no different, except now your people need you to survive it while standing tall instead of hiding." Another crash of thunder rolled overhead, and Elena felt his hand tighten painfully around her own, but he did not collapse this time. He held steady, his breathing ragged but controlled, and slowly, the trembling that had gripped his body began to ease. "I'm here," Elena said, quieter now, though still firm. "Every storm, remember? I'm not going anywhere." Kale straightened slowly, drawing on some reserve of strength Elena could only guess at, and when he lifted his sword and turned back toward the battlefield, his voice carried the same commanding authority it always had, undiminished by the fear that had nearly claimed him moments earlier. "Push them back to the ridgeline," he shouted to his warriors, his voice cutting through the storm with renewed strength. "This territory does not yield, not tonight, not ever." His warriors responded with renewed energy, rallying behind their alpha's steadied resolve, and the tide of battle began shifting visibly as Kale led a fierce counterattack against Victor's forces, his fear, though never fully banished, no longer controlling his actions in the way his rival had gambled it would. The battle at the ridge continued for another hour, before Victor's forces, realizing the gamble on Kale's supposed weakness had failed entirely, sounded a retreat, and withdrew back across the border into their own territory. The storm began to ease shortly after, as though the sky itself had finished delivering whatever test it intended for the night, and the rain softened into a gentle patter as exhausted warriors began tending to the wounded and securing the border once more. Elena remained close to Kale throughout the aftermath, watching him direct the cleanup efforts with the same steady authority he had shown throughout his entire rule. No trace of the trembling fear visible now, beyond the occasional flicker in his eyes whenever thunder rumbled softly in the storm's retreating edges. When the immediate crisis had finally settled, he found her standing near the medical tents that had been quickly assembled to treat injured warriors, and the look he gave her carried more gratitude than words could easily express. "You saved more than my composure tonight," he said quietly, once they had a moment of relative privacy. "You may have saved this entire territory." "You saved it," Elena corrected gently. "I only reminded you of something you already knew, that you're stronger than the fear that follows you." Word of the battle spread quickly through the pack house over the following days, and with it came an unexpected shift in how many of the warriors viewed their Alpha King. Rather than seeing weakness in the brief moment of hesitation witnessed by those closest to him during the battle, most of the pack instead saw a leader who had fought through visible struggle and emerged victorious regardless, a display of resilience that impressed even some of the more traditionalist warriors who had previously questioned Elena's growing influence. Gareth, in particular, sought Elena out personally in the days following the battle, offering an apology that clearly cost his pride considerably to deliver. "I misjudged the situation," he admitted gruffly, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the clinic room. "Whatever role you play in our Alpha's life, it clearly strengthens rather than weakens him. I was wrong to doubt that." Elena accepted the apology graciously, understanding the significant effort it required from a warrior of his standing and pride. Desmond's shift in attitude proved slower and more cautious, though even he could not deny the tactical advantage Elena's presence had provided during the crisis, and his sharp observations of her began carrying a grudging respect that had been entirely absent during their earlier confrontations. Victor's failed attempt to exploit Kale's fear also carried consequences beyond the immediate battle, as news of the Eastern Pack's defeat spread throughout the region, discouraging other potential rivals from considering similar strategies against a territory whose Alpha had proven capable of overcoming whatever weakness rumors suggested he carried. In the weeks that followed, Kale's relationship with his fear continued evolving in ways neither he nor Elena had fully anticipated. Storms still triggered a response, the deep instinctual dread never fully disappearing, but each time proved slightly more manageable than the last. Elena's steady presence beside him, gradually rewriting years of trauma into something he no longer had to face entirely alone. On a clear evening nearly 2 months after the battle at the ridge, Cale invited Elena to walk with him through the same garden where he had first shared the story of his parents' deaths. The air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach, storm season finally drawing to its natural close for the year, and Elena sensed something different in Cale's demeanor as they walked together beneath a sky full of stars rather than storm clouds. "I spoke with the pack council today," Cale said, stopping beside the same low stone wall where they had first kissed months earlier, "about formally recognizing your position within this territory, beyond simply serving as healer." Elena's heart quickened. "What did they decide?" "That decision remains partly in your hands," Cale replied, turning to face her fully. "I have spent this entire year discovering that the strength I always believed I needed to project alone was never truly meant to be carried in isolation. You have shown me that vulnerability, shared honestly with the right person, does not diminish leadership but rather deepens it into something far more genuine and far more resilient." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object, and Elena's breath caught as she recognized the significance immediately, understanding exactly what he was about to ask before he spoke another word. "I am asking you to stand beside me, not simply as a healer who tends my wounds," Cale said, his voice steady despite the enormity of the question, "but as my equal, my mate, and eventually, if you'll have me, the queen this territory has been waiting for without ever knowing it." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and Cale's answering smile carried none of the careful restraint he had maintained during their earliest days together, only pure, unguarded joy. Winter arrived soon after, storm season finally releasing its grip on the territory, and though Elena knew future storms would inevitably return with the changing seasons, she also knew that whatever fear those storms carried for Cale, he would never again face them entirely alone. The pack that had once questioned her presence now embraced her as their future queen, recognizing in her the same quiet strength that had helped their alpha overcome the deepest fear of his life. And on the nights when distant thunder still occasionally rolled across the sky, Cale no longer needed to hide his fear beneath a blanket in another's room, seeking comfort in secret and shame. Instead, he simply reached for Elena's hand, wherever they happened to be, and found in her steady presence the same unwavering safety that had first drawn his wolf to her door on that very first stormy night, though now it came not from desperate fear alone, but from a love that had grown strong enough to weather any storm that life might still bring their way.